Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, Daniel joins me to discuss testing your React apps. But before we get to that, Daniel, could you maybe give me a bit of your story when it comes to your development career so far and kind of how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, definitely. First of all, thanks for having me. About my story, that's a funny one because I actually started focused on mostly on backend. A years ago, mostly with .NET, Java. That's kind of where I started programming. But then, like a year and a half or something like that into this process, I said, okay, I think I'm starting to get the hang of this thing called React, the hang of this thing called JavaScript, and I transitioned to front end. And when I did so, that's kind of where, my React career started. I had done some front-end stuff in the past, mainly with PHP, jQuery, some stuff in other companies I was working, but yeah, I didn't have that much familiarity with React and these JavaScript frameworks. And once I did, okay, so let's see if there's an opportunity for me to do this full-time. Luckily, there was a team hiring back then because it didn't fit with the job I was doing, and I had to transition to a new role. And that's when mostly I started working as a front-end engineer, mostly focused on React, JavaScript. I left behind Java, .NET, all those things. And yeah, during this time in React, I learned that I really liked a couple of things in the ecosystem. The first one was definitely testing, because I think that the time, and I would say that this was around 2018, something like that. I remember that it matched a bit when hooks came out. And that's when people now didn't know how to test stuff, and a couple of stuff changed. And then I saw this as my opportunity in the company I was working on to see, okay, this is something that I'm starting to really like. And this is something that in the React ecosystem, there doesn't seem to be a lot of people focusing their attention into. So I said, okay, let's start doing this. Let's focus on this. And I ended up becoming like the testing guy in the company that I was working on, because every time someone needed something with testing, I was showing up in those threads. Like, even if it was not my team, I would see people asking stuff about testing, React, how they do changing stuff. And I was like, okay, I can definitely chip in on this, because like I remember we were migrating an application back then to hooks. And that's kind of where my opportunity came, because I said, no, I can definitely focus on testing on this thing. And I migrated the entire solution, all the tests that had previously, we were using Enzyme, and I ended up migrating those for the React testing library. And yeah, I got a lot of experience with stuff that I saw that people did that were okay, stuff that were not as okay, but still there were not those many standards as we have right now. It was still like I would say it was a gray area in testing in React in those times. But yeah, then it was mostly testing back then. Then I decided that I wanted to transition into doing DevRel. That's the job that I'm doing now. I'm working as developer advocate, but it took me like 3-4 years into getting to where I am right now and being able to do this job at OLX, where I'm employed right now. And yeah, during this time, I kept my front-end roots. I kept doing front-end. I kept doing a lot of content about testing, talks, mainly talks in conferences and events. Most recently, I still like doing testing, but I wrote a book about React Query called State Management with React Query. So I guess that's my second love, I would say right now, which is React Query. And yeah, right now is most part of my job is to help the community, help teach people, help them grow, and do that as part of my job, and go to events and meet people, amazing people as well. So yeah, I would say that's a bit of a relevant part of my career and what took me to be here today. I try to focus a bit more on testing because I guess that's where we want to transition this discussion. But yeah, that's mostly it.
Yeah, very cool. And I think that it's also cool that to me, it sounds like you got into kind of the testing side of things more out of like the necessity of where you could add value in your company. And you kind of saw, okay, this is my opportunity to really add value here. So you kind of dove into that side of things, as I feel like a lot of developers don't necessarily love testing and kind of getting into testing stuff, and they kind of prefer, I know myself personally, I prefer kind of developing new features and kind of doing that side of it. Good testing is just kind of like, I guess I probably should do this thing, so maybe a good place to go from that is, why do you think a lot of developers kind of don't like testing? Do you think it's maybe a part of they just want to build new things, or do you think that there's some things inherent to testing that are just not super fun for developers, or why do you kind of think that is?
I would say that first of all, at least speaking from my experience, the first one was most of the times testing comes at the end of your development cycle. So, and not often people do TDD, or do they test as long as they develop features. Most of the times what happens is people are developing, they finish their feature, and they said, oh no, now there's this barrier that stops me from delivering, which is testing. And that's like the first aspect that makes people think, oh, testing. Like a fun story. One time I was working with a team, and one of the developers came to me and said, hey, but why should I write tests? Or how do I explain my product manager that I'm going to need more time of this sprint to deliver tests and make sure that this is going to impact the delivery of the functionality? And most of the times people, I think, see tests as not as a necessity, but as a nice to have. I think it's cultural. It's cultural about how they learn tests in the first place. It's cultural about how teams approach it. So I would say the first issue is that one. The second one is obviously, I would say, knowledge barriers. I remember when I learned testing, it was mostly focused on backend, but I didn't like testing that much because first, it was something new that I had to learn. It didn't fit with the scope of the tool that I was working on. It was some extra technology, extra things that I had to learn that I didn't fully grasp as well. And most of the times, people don't take the time to learn testing properly because, well, their focus is in delivering. They want to deliver functionality, they want to deliver value to the business, as they should. But most of the times people don't see that testing is something that, well, it makes sure that those functionalities are working and make sure that they are not going to break. And if you come back to them a couple of weeks or months after, you don't break them. And yeah, all this to say that, yeah, probably I got myself lost a bit in here, but recapping, the first one is definitely the seeing it as a necessity plus matching the time to deliver, and the second one is the knowledge of the testing, how testing works, because people don't see it as something that is absolute. I think now it's changing. I really feel like the last years in JavaScript and mostly focusing on React, I think that this ended up changing a bit, mostly I think thanks to the React testing library and to tools to end-to-end like Cypress and Playwright. I think those are things that have been changing how the community looks at testing, because these tools ends up making tests more accessible and giving more value than just the security that tests gives to you. This is a different point that we can segue into the future. But yeah, I think that it's mainly these 2 points.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it is often viewed as a nice to have rather than something that you kind of need to do. And then also, developers generally are sometimes optimistic on their delivery timelines anyways. So if you then have to go back and say, hey, we need another week to make sure testing's in place, it can be kind of tough to make that argument as well. And like you said, there's also the technical aspect of, there are some complexities when coming to test your application. So do you want to also add that into your code base and kind of take the time to do that as well? And if you don't already know how to do it with a certain testing frameworks, which I'm sure we'll kind of get into some of those today as well, but if you don't already know how to do it, it can be a little bit of a lift to kind of get developers up to speed on how testing works and stuff like that. So I think those are all really good points. And that kind of, brings me to the question of if you're a developer and you're trying to explain to maybe a project manager or, someone maybe even that they're a little less technical on the importance of testing, how do you think that someone should go about kind of explaining to them why you might need testing in the application?
Well, I would say that there are 2 points. Usually I would say I'm a bit more aggressive and just go to people and say, do you like to sleep at night? Because that's what testing allows you. It allows you to sleep at night because you know that the code that you wrote is working. But in a more, I would say, more non-aggressive way here, definitely the security that it gives you, because one product management, most of the times they see value as the money that the product is going to generate or the time they take to deliver. And if you reason with them that first, if you're testing something and it's going to ensure that the quality of the thing that they're spending money on is going to be, well, top notch, is going to make sure that it's not going to break and waste more time in the future, then definitely it can be reason too. Because, well, we all trust that we all want to trust that the code that we are building is safe and it's working and it's not breaking. So obviously this is something that, well, we should also try to pass to non-technical people to make sure that, okay, what we are delivering is actually working, and we are making sure that we don't have to go back in a week or two to fix something that is broken because of our tests, because not having tests.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, the biggest arguments are, for one, it can increase your developer productivity in the long run to where, if tests are catching issues and you don't have to go back and fix those issues after the fact, then you already have like the context for those issues when the test breaks and you go to fix it. And it also makes your app more extendable and gives you kind of confidence that your app is working. So I think all those are really good reasons there. And transitioning into kind of testing React, are there common issues that people run into when it kind of comes to testing their React app? Earlier, you kind of mentioned hooks maybe being a little bit kind of tricky and an issue for some people. So are there any kind of common problems you see people run into when going to test their React apps?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we could spend hours here speaking. So I'll try to narrow it down. I would say that, well, since I caught the hooks transition, and that's one of the ones that I found out that was and I think that's probably the way that transition into having the React testing library as a de facto solution for unit and integration testing. But the first one was definitely when hooks came out. Everything that was tested being using Enzyme, and they were focusing on state, their tests broke because hooks. But when the new API came out, Enzyme, which was the de facto solution back then, was not able to support the transition. So if you migrated to hooks and you had your tests focusing on internals like the component props or the component state, those things would break. That was the like one of the things that ended up happening back then, and this was kind of like the one of the reasons for the testing library not to show up, because it is only end up, let's see how the word in English, sometimes this happens to me, to and not to enhance but to show the value of the testing library. But what other issues like hooks was definitely one of them. Then you start having like other points, like for instance data fetching. How do you test data fetching in React applications? This is definitely one of the things that is probably after hooks gave me more trouble with testing. So there are definitely a couple of problems, but I would say that the biggest issue that people are doing in testing, and even though the React testing library has been around for a couple of years, the biggest issue that people are still doing is focusing on implementation details. I think that this kind of, and going back to when I mentioned Enzyme, the reason why it broke was because we were focusing on state and props and all those things. And this was kind of like opening a door or shining some light into one of the issues that we were doing back then, which was focusing on implementation details. Now, this is a completely different topic, but I think since we're probably going to head up into the React testing library, reason I'll transition into it, because I think that this is kind of the main selling point of the React testing library and kind of the thing that we all want to focus, even though like we're 2023 and there are still people that haven't fully grasped this concept, but we don't want to focus on implementation details, even though that's what we learned when we were learning testing back then, especially with unit tests. We always seen that unit tests, we should always check for implementation and check if our implementation is working. But what's the side effect of this? The side effect is we're having our tests, we're using our tests, but then something like hooks come around and changes completely the React API. Even though our code is still being displayed to the user the same way, the internals of that code changed. And because we were focusing on those internals, when these things changed, our tests broke. And this is kind of like one of the reasons that I think prompted Kenzie Dodds, the creator of the testing library, to think about this, which is, what if instead we focused on building our tests the same way our user uses our code, our uses our application, following a user-centric approach. And by doing so, if we follow this direction, then we have the safety that even if we change some of the internals of the code, but the behavior that the user will see is the same, then that's definitely what we're going to get and have the security that our test still works. And this is kind of like the main point of creating the DOM testing library, which is the base of where all the testing libraries are built upon, which is testing our code the same way your user interacts with it. And if we go into our testing and think about this in this perspective, then definitely we're going to be sure that even if internals, like for instance as hooks, show up, our code will still work because our tests will still work because our code is still producing the same HTML, the same thing that the user expected it to see. I don't know if this was kind of the answer that you were expecting to with this question, but I would say that probably the biggest issue, that people have when testing React applications is focusing on user on implementation details. I forgot to speak there for a bit. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So to me, it sounds like one of the biggest mistakes that people make when testing comes to testing, like how they're actually implementing the interface, whether it's using hooks or, not so common anymore, but you also have class components, and then you might have a hook that has different props and stuff like that. And people were like testing how they were actually implementing this code rather than testing what the user is actually seeing and interacting with. And this kind of, and coupling your testing to how you're implementing the code was kind of breaking your tests and maybe making them a little bit more flaky, when in reality, it wasn't really changing the user experience or the user interface at all. So your tests were just kind of, testing how a programmer implements it rather than testing the actual user interaction, which is probably what you actually want to be testing within your tests. So it sounds like React Testing Library is a solution to help you test the non-implementation details, what the user is actually kind of interacting with. So maybe now if we could transition into, how does React Testing Library do this? How does it help you kind of test what the user is actually doing rather than the implementation details?
So the first thing here is that you don't have access to those things. Well, technically you could, but it's not exposed to you. So the main APIs and all those things that the React Testing Library or the DOM Testing Library offers to you is ways so that you can test your code without going into implementation details. So for instances, you don't have access to the component state, you don't have access to the prop that your component has, you don't have access, for instances, to query by class or by IDs, which is something that you could use in Enzyme. For instance, in Enzyme, by using the find API, you could find for something on the DOM which was by the component name or by the class name assigned to your component or by an ID. With the testing library, these things are not exposed to you. It only gives you APIs to, first of all, and this is kind of like one of the main reasons that made me like it so much, is it's focused on accessibility first. So if you use testing library the way that it's meant to be used and focus on the right queries and follow the query order, which is something we can talk a bit further, you'll be checking and finding your components and finding for stuff on the UI the accessible way. And this ends up helping you even finding accessibility issues in your code in times that you didn't even know that they could be there. I remember that this was something that in this first time when I started using testing library, I remember that I was trying to use some queries that the React testing library gave to me, and I could not use them because the design system that the company I was working on back then, components were not accessible. And if they were not accessible, I could not use the accessibility first queries that the testing library gave to me. So I would definitely say that the way that you query for stuff tries to mimic the way that the user looks for stuff. Now, to give a more particular example, for instance, how does a user know that an input is going to be a username input? Well, there's going to be something, a label or something next to it that says username. And this is one of the queries, query by label text or query by text. There are a bunch of queries that support and try to focus on the same patterns that the user does when interacting with your code. And this is good because there are three groups of queries. I say there's a fourth one, but that one doesn't really count. But the first group of queries are the queries accessible to everyone. And these are the queries that fully represent the experience of visual users, but also users who use any type of assistive technology. So by going in with these queries first, then you have a way to search for stuff on the DOM the same way that any type of user that might be using your application will have. So querying is definitely the first change in here, because now you're looking into our code the same way that your user looks into your UI. So this focus changes a bit your perspective on how you test stuff, because before you were focusing on the implementation of those components and the implementation of your React component. Now you're focusing on it like the same way that a user is looking into your application. So that's definitely one of the shifts. The second one is the way that you interact with these components. So there are things like, there are actually two APIs. One is native, which is called the Fire Event API, which allows you to fire a single event. But this one is not that used, because then there was a companion library that's called User Event Library, which allows you to simulate all the events that a user does when interacting with your components. For instance, when you click on a button, there's not just the on-click event that's fired, where there's the on-mouse over, on-mouse down, the click eventually, on-mouse out. So there are all these events that's going to happen when interacting with a button. And the User Event Library is a companion lib that's pretty much already comes, now that we don't have Create React App anymore, or it's not incentivized, but with Create, it already came with Create React App as a companion for the testing library, and allows you to fire all these events specifically the same way that the browser does when interacting with stuff if a user is doing it. So as you can see, just for querying stuff and interacting with the UI, we're always doing this in our code in the same way that we are doing it as a user. But now we're doing this in our unit/integration tests. So this is pretty much the mindset that comes to change compared to what we had previously with Enzyme. Which, don't get me wrong, Enzyme is great. The thing is, if you don't know how to use it properly, you might be focusing on implementation details accidentally. And yeah, I guess these are some of the main points for testing library. I don't know if I forgot any, but yeah, definitely I would say querying and the way that we interact with stuff is definitely focused on the user perspective.
Yep, absolutely. And I would say maybe a kind of concrete example, the core difference with this would be if you're using maybe one of the older testing libraries, you would query a class name or query something that is specific to the implementation of a certain component. So for that input, maybe you will put a class name on that input saying username input or something like that. And then in your tests, you just kind of use that. Well, if in the future you remove that class name or you change the name of that class name, it would break your tests, but that wouldn't necessarily impact how the user is interacting with that. It probably doesn't change what the user actually sees on the page and different things like that just because you change the name of a class. Of course, you might change the CSS or something like that, but the core functionality of it probably doesn't change. But with React Testing Library, if you use the contains a label text or something like that, what the user is actually going to see for that input, or even like the ARIA label that is probably going to be consistent across all labels that you're going to use. So going with that more accessibility focused approach, the user, that's not going to break your test because that is what the user is actually going to interact with regardless of the implementation details. So does it sound like I'm understanding the benefits of how React Testing Library does its querying there?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that you mentioned there, and that I would think that, well, it might be a necessity sometimes, but in others it might not even be, is some of the times you would be like, I remember doing this with Enzyme, just to mention, because that's the thing I was using before. But I would query for a component by using the component name, and then I would check if it contains the label text, like you like the example that you're mentioning. Now I don't need to do that. I just query by label text, and if it gives me back the node that I'm expecting, then I know that that thing is built on by that. So queries can even be helped as their own assertion by sorts, because if you're trying to search by something that has a specific label text and that thing is not returning you anything, then that's probably like a connection between an input and the label text that's missing. So this was actually like the first example issue that I had with the design system I was using back then, because that thing was not connecting the label text with the inputs the way that is supposed to be done in HTML. So yeah, it ends up helping you find these issues even when you're not looking for them, I'd guess.
Yep, absolutely. And I would say generally using React Testing Library or testing what the user is actually going to be interacting with is a good way to prevent yourself a lot of headache in the future, to where if you're finding yourself when you go and refactor a component that you also have to go and change all of your tests, even though the functionality of the component didn't change, that might be a good sign that you're actually testing implementation details rather than what the user is interacting with there. So I think that's really great here, but maybe just quick here at the end as a one final question, is there any common mistakes that you see people make when using React Testing Library? Like, I'm guessing, I'm sure, I know I've used this library before. It's a great library. It's really good at testing what the user is actually doing and avoiding these implementation details, but I'm guessing that you could probably still use the tool incorrectly and maybe make some mistakes with it that maybe reduces some of the benefits that come with it. So are there any kind of, high level, a couple of mistakes that people tend to make with it?
Yeah, there are a couple ones. I would leave the biggest one for the last, because I think that's a good way to close. I would say, like, most of the times people don't know which variant of queries to use. That's one of the things that happens, because there are, besides having the queries family, each query has a variant. So you can use a query by, a get by, or a find by query. Most of the times people don't know when to use the find by, which is the asynchronous query. So this is the type of query that you can use when you're waiting for something that's going to be on the DOM, but it's not quite there yet. And people end up messing this thing and using like other asynchronous utils. So there's kind of like a mismatch with how people see synchronicity. I don't know if this is a word, but asynchronous patterns in the testing library. There's a couple of other ones that end up happening with. Let's see. For instances, there are a couple ones. One that's very simple, but it's very common. Even though it was very common back then, I don't know if people still do it nowadays, which is using cleanup. The thing is, like, if you're using Jest, or I don't know if VTest already supports that thing, but if you have a testing framework that's built on top of, I think it's Jasmine, it might be wrong, but cleanup already runs for you. So cleanup is pretty much a tool that allows you to clean up before each test. And so you make sure that your tests are not leaking into each other. I've seen this one a lot. And then there are many other ones. So, like, if you there's a good suggestion for you to check. There's an article by Kenzie Dodds, the creator of the testing library, called "The Common Mistakes of Using the React Testing Library," something like that. And it pretty much picks up a bunch of things that is seen online. In my talk, React Hooks broke my tests know what, that I've been doing like for 4 or 5 years by now, and I still do it to this day because it's still relevant and it's still helpful. I usually like to wrap up the talk with these mistakes as well, which is I actually found some other ones that I was having back then. So these ones are the ones that I had from my experience. Then when Kent put out his blog post, some of them ended up matching, some of them I had that he didn't have. So we ended up chatting with this one, but the biggest one, and this is actually one that I actually had the opportunity to talk with Kent about, and he said that this is definitely the one that to this day he still gets a lot of questions with it, which is using ACT. ACT, the thing is, and I'll try to explain this in a way without showing any code, but this is most of the times derived by an error that happens in your tests, which is called an update to a component name was not wrapped in ACT. And most of the times what people do is they wrap that component with ACT. Now, for those of you who don't know what ACT is an util that React offers you. This is not from the testing library, it's from React. That's pretty much when you're building tests in React, it makes sure that if you're doing things that are called units of interaction with the user interface, for instance, clicking on a button, your interaction with an interface, ACT is a thing that pretty much should be used to wrap this unit of interaction. So pretty much you have ACT, open parameters, open braces, you add the code that we're going to do the interaction with the user interface, and you close them. And this is pretty much making sure that this update is finished and applied to the UI before your test proceeds. And this is pretty much what ACT is. And now what happens is that sometimes people are writing tests and they see this error, which is an update to component name needs to be wrapped in ACT, and people go ahead and put ACT in everything. The thing is, so far in the 4 or 5 years that I've been using the testing library, I only had to use ACT once, and it was not in the React testing library. It was in the React testing library, and it was a completely different thing. Now, when I say this, most of the times people look at me like, what are you saying? Like, my test is full of ACTs. Because most of the times people then this is kind of the place of misusing the tool or not knowing what the error is before trying to fix it. Because most of the times what people do is, they just put ACT, the test disappears, the error disappears, and they continue with their life. The thing is, this error shows up most of the times to let people know that something is happening in their test that they did not test it. So, because like I said, ACT is something that needs to make sure that all the state updates and all those things have finished before you proceed in your test. So when this error shows up, it's pretty much React way of telling you, hey, look, something here is not fully tested. There's some updates to the UI that we are not counting about. For instance, one very common aspect that causes this mistake is not finishing or not asserting that a loading went, a spinner appeared or disappeared or something like that. This is one of the issues that might happen in your tests. So most of the times people wrap those things with ACT and they go on with their life, which in reality, what they should do is whenever they get this error, they should look into our tests and say, okay, for this scenario, what am I not testing? And most of the time, this is when you look and you start finding issues in your tests that you didn't even know that were there, instead of just wrapping those things with ACT. Because when you wrap the component with ACT, the issue disappears, but your test is still not complete. There's still something happening in the background that you are not looking. So I gave a good explanation, but that's definitely the biggest issue and the biggest problem that people do. So if you have ACT in your tests and you don't find a way, or you haven't found a way to get rid of it, please feel free to give me a message either on LinkedIn or on Twitter. I would love to help as well.
Perfect. So it sounds like that ACT warning is more of a signal that you're probably missing something from your tests, rather than you should actually just wrap everything in an ACT. So
exactly.
I think with that, Daniel, we've definitely covered some issues people run into with the React testing library, some ways to solve those, focusing on testing non-implementation details and what the user is actually going to be doing and focusing on that. And then also covered a couple common mistakes there. So with that, Daniel, if people want to stay up to date with stuff that you're doing online, they want to make sure that they are seeing the talks that you're putting out and all that stuff, where can they go to follow you?
Yeah, definitely. You can find me pretty much any social network at the handle Daniel JC Afonso. So I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn. My blog is also on the same name. So pretty much if you follow that handle, you pretty much find me anywhere. So
perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Daniel. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to be here.